What you're about to hear is something that's changing the entire calculation in this war, and I guarantee most mainstream outlets aren't giving you the full picture. Just days ago, Ukraine pulled off something that has the Kremlin scrambling, the White House carefully choosing every word, and military analysts around the world completely reassessing what they thought they knew about this conflict. I'm Ryan Blake, and today we're diving deep into the attack on Engels 2 airbase, the response from Washington that came within hours, and why Vladimir Putin is facing the most critical strategic decisions of this entire war. Stay with me because by the end of this, you're going to understand why January 2026 might be the month that determines everything. Let's start with what happened in the early morning hours of January 4th. While most of the world was still shaking off the New Year celebrations, something extraordinary was unfolding 700 kilometers inside Russian territory. Multiple Ukrainian drones, and I'm talking about a coordinated swarm here, descended on Engels 2 airbase in Saratov Oblast. Now, if you've been following this channel, you know Engels 2 isn't just any airbase. This is home to Russia's strategic bomber fleet, the Tu-95 Bears and Tu-160 Blackjacks, the aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons. These are the planes that have been launching cruise missile attacks on Ukrainian cities for nearly 3 years now. And here's what they're not telling you on the evening news. This wasn't Ukraine's first rodeo with Engels. They've hit this facility before, back in December 2022, and again in March 2025. But this latest strike, this one's different, and I'll explain exactly why in a moment. Russian officials initially tried to downplay the attack, claiming their air defenses shot down all the drones before they could cause significant damage. Standard playbook, right? But here's the catch. Within hours, satellite imagery started circulating, and local Russian telegram channels, the ones the Kremlin can't fully control, were reporting massive explosions and fires that burned for hours. We're talking about secondary explosions, the kind that happen when fuel depots or ammunition storage gets hit. One firefighter was killed trying to contain the blaze, and at least 10 people were injured. Those aren't the numbers you get from drones that were all successfully intercepted. The math doesn't add up, and that's exactly what Putin's inner circle is dealing with right now. But let's zoom out for a second, because understanding this attack requires understanding the broader pattern that's emerged since the calendar flipped to 2026. According to Russia's own defense ministry, and this is publicly available data they released just yesterday, Ukraine has targeted Moscow with drones every single day of this year. Every single day. We're talking about a systematic campaign that represents a fundamental shift in Ukraine's military strategy. They're not just defending anymore. They're taking the fight deep into Russian territory, hitting strategic targets that were supposed to be untouchable. The Engels attack is part of this larger offensive that's also struck oil refineries in Tatarstan, fuel depots in Tula and Kaluga, and even command posts in Krasnodar. Ukraine started 2026 by making a very clear statement. Nowhere in Russia is safe, especially not the infrastructure that supports Putin's war machine. Now here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the part that should make everyone sit up and pay attention. The timing of the Engels attack wasn't random. Just 5 days before those drones hit the airbase, Russia's chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, announced that Vladimir Putin had personally ordered the expansion of Russia's so-called buffer zone in northeastern Ukraine. We're talking about the Sumy and Kharkiv regions. Putin's directive, according to Gerasimov, is for Russian forces to carve out even more Ukrainian territory throughout 2026 to create a deeper security zone. The official justification, protecting Russian border regions from shelling and drone attacks. But here's the catch that no one's talking about. How's that working out when Ukrainian drones are reaching 700 kilometers into Russia and hitting strategic bomber bases? The emperor has no clothes, and the Engels attack just ripped the last thread off. Let me paint you the strategic picture that's keeping Russian military planners up at night. Every single one of those strategic bombers at Engels represents not just a $100 million aircraft, but a critical node in Russia's ability to project power. These aren't fighter jets you can replace quickly. These are specialized long-range bombers that took years to build, require extensive maintenance infrastructure, and carry crews that need years of training. When Ukraine damages or destroys even one of these aircraft, they're not just taking out a plane. They're degrading Russia's strategic aviation capability for months or potentially years. And remember Operation Spiderweb back in June 2025? That massive coordinated Ukrainian drone attack hit 4 different Russian air bases simultaneously and damaged or destroyed an estimated 10% of Russia's entire strategic bomber fleet in one night. Germany's intelligence assessment confirmed it. We're talking about possibly 41 aircraft affected across multiple bases. That was 6 months ago, and Russia still hasn't fully recovered from those losses. Now, the White House response to the Engels attack? This is where things get delicate, and you need to understand the chess game being played here. Within hours of the attack, questions started flying at the Trump administration. Did you know about this? Did you authorize this? What's your position on Ukraine striking deep into Russian territory? And here's what they're not telling you. The official response has been remarkably measured, almost eerily so. President Trump himself made a statement saying that U.S. national security officials have determined Ukraine did not target Putin's personal residence in a recent drone strike, directly contradicting Russian claims. But notice what he didn't say. He didn't condemn the Engels attack. He didn't call for restraint. He simply clarified that one specific target wasn't hit. That silence, that careful diplomatic dance, that's the real message. Behind closed doors, and this comes from sources familiar with the discussions, the Trump administration is walking an incredibly fine line. On one hand, Trump has made it clear he wants to end this war, that he sees it as a drain on resources and a distraction from other priorities. He's even floated ideas about negotiations and peace talks. But on the other hand, and here's the part that should make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the current administration's position, there hasn't been a single move to restrict Ukraine's use of long-range strike capabilities. Remember when this was a huge controversy under the previous administration? Whether to allow Ukraine to use American-provided weapons to hit targets inside Russia? That debate seems to have quietly evaporated. Ukraine is now routinely striking hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory, hitting strategic targets with apparent impunity, and Washington's response is essentially, we didn't target Putin's house. Everything else is fair game. This brings us to Putin's urgent war decisions, and this is where the story gets even more complex. Multiple intelligence assessments and reports from Russian military bloggers, the ones who actually have connections to people on the ground, paint a picture of a Russian leadership facing some very uncomfortable realities. First, the buffer zone strategy isn't working. Putin ordered the expansion of territorial control in Ukraine to supposedly protect Russian regions from attacks, but those attacks are increasing in frequency and penetrating deeper into Russia than ever before. Second, Russia's strategic aviation, the crown jewel of their long-range strike capability, is being systematically degraded. They've had to relocate bombers to more remote bases, which increases response times and operational complexity. They've had to build new protective shelters, which takes time and resources, and they're still getting hit. But here's what really matters, and this is the calculation that's forcing Putin's hand right now. Every day this war continues, Ukraine gets better at these deep strikes. Their drone technology improves. Their intelligence gathering becomes more sophisticated. Their ability to coordinate complex operations against multiple targets simultaneously advances. Meanwhile, Russia's ability to replace losses in strategic aircraft is limited. They're producing maybe a handful of new or modernized bombers per year. Just 3 days ago, reports emerged that Russia delivered 2 modernized Tu-160M strategic bombers. 2. That's their replacement rate, while Ukraine is damaging or destroying these aircraft faster than they can be replaced. The math here is brutal, and it's forcing Putin into a series of decisions that have no good options. Option 1, escalate, hit back harder, launch more missile strikes against Ukrainian cities, maybe even dust off those nuclear threats that have become almost routine at this point. But here's the problem with escalation. Ukraine has already proven they can strike back against targets that really matter to Russia's war effort. Oil refineries, fuel depots, military air bases, the very infrastructure that keeps the Russian military machine running. Escalation could trigger even more devastating Ukrainian responses, and Putin knows the West is watching his every move. Option 2, negotiate. Sit down with Ukraine and actually work toward a peace deal. But from what position? Putin spent the last year making incremental territorial gains at enormous cost, and now Ukraine is demonstrating they can hit strategic targets deep inside Russia. Any negotiation right now would be from a position of increasing vulnerability, not strength. Option 3, double down on the buffer zone strategy despite all evidence that it's not working. Keep pushing for more Ukrainian territory. Keep trying to create that security zone and hope that eventually you can push Ukrainian strike capabilities far enough back that places like Engels become safe again. But this requires sustaining offensive operations while simultaneously defending an increasingly porous rear area. Let me tell you what's really happening here, and this is based on analysis from multiple sources, including the Institute for the Study of War, European intelligence assessments, and patterns in Russian military deployments. Putin is being forced to fight a two-front war within the same conflict. On the front lines in Ukraine, Russia is trying to maintain offensive momentum, pushing for those buffer zones, trying to capture more territory before any potential negotiations. But simultaneously, they're having to redirect resources to protect strategic assets deep inside Russia. Air defense systems that could be supporting frontline operations are instead being pulled back to guard air bases and critical infrastructure. Intelligence assets that could be focused on Ukrainian military positions are trying to figure out how drones are penetrating so deep into Russian territory. It's a resource allocation nightmare, and there's no easy answer. Now let's talk about what this means for the trajectory of this war, because that's what you really need to understand. We're seeing a fundamental shift in the military balance, and it's not being driven by tanks or artillery or even fighter jets. It's being driven by relatively cheap, increasingly sophisticated drones that can travel hundreds of kilometers and strike targets that were supposed to be beyond reach. Ukraine has essentially solved a problem that has plagued militaries throughout history. How do you project power deep into enemy territory when you don't have air superiority and you don't have massive long-range bomber fleets? The answer, it turns out, is swarms of drones launched from ordinary vehicles that can coordinate attacks, evade air defenses through sheer numbers, and cause strategic-level damage at a fraction of the cost of traditional strike platforms. The implications of this go far beyond just this war. Military planners around the world are watching and taking notes. The United States, China, NATO members, everyone is seeing that strategic targets once considered safe because they were far from the front lines are now vulnerable. The entire concept of rear area security is being rewritten in real time. But for our purposes, for understanding what happens next in Ukraine, this shift means that Putin's strategy of trading space for time, of slowly grinding forward while assuming his strategic depth protects his most valuable assets, that strategy is obsolete. Ukraine demonstrated they can reach 700 kilometers into Russia. What happens when they develop or acquire drones that can reach even farther? What happens when they can consistently hit air bases 1,000 kilometers away, or oil refineries in Siberia, or rail hubs that are critical for moving supplies to the front? This brings us back to the White House response and why it matters so much right now. The Trump administration's carefully calibrated silence on these deep strikes is, in its own way, a form of tacit approval. By not condemning the attacks, by not placing restrictions on how Ukraine uses its strike capabilities, by simply clarifying that specific targets weren't hit while saying nothing about the ones that were, Washington is essentially giving Ukraine a green light to continue this campaign. And here's what's really fascinating. This might actually align with Trump's stated goal of ending the war. How? By changing the cost-benefit calculation for Putin. If Russia can't protect its strategic assets, if the war is coming home in increasingly painful ways, if the economic and military costs keep rising while territorial gains remain minimal, then maybe, just maybe, Putin becomes more willing to actually negotiate a real peace deal rather than just a pause to regroup. But there's a darker scenario we need to consider, and it's the one that keeps Western intelligence agencies up at night. What happens if Putin decides that conventional responses to these attacks aren't sufficient? Russia's nuclear doctrine, which was modified in 2024, specifically identifies attacks on strategic assets and critical infrastructure as potential triggers for nuclear response. Now, do I think Putin is going to launch nuclear weapons over a drone strike on an airbase? Honestly, no. The political and strategic costs would be catastrophic, and it wouldn't even solve his fundamental problem. But the fact that we're even having this conversation, that attacks on places like Engels force us to think about nuclear escalation risks, that tells you how high the stakes have become. Here's what I think happens next, and this is based on the patterns we're seeing in conversations with analysts who actually understand this conflict. Putin will likely order increased air defense deployments around strategic facilities, which he's already doing. We'll see more Russian attempts to strike Ukrainian drone production facilities and launch sites. Russia will probably try to hit back with their own escalated missile strikes against Ukrainian cities, not because it achieves military objectives, but because Putin needs to show he's responding. But fundamentally, the strategic picture has shifted. Ukraine has demonstrated an asymmetric capability that Russia is struggling to counter, and that changes everything about how this war progresses. The buffer zone expansion that Putin ordered for 2026? It's already failing before it really begins, because you can't create a buffer zone large enough to protect against drones that can fly 700 kilometers. The negotiations that Trump wants to facilitate, they're going to be shaped by this new reality where Ukraine has offensive reach deep into Russia. The military balance that everyone assumed favored Russia because of their size and resources, it's being challenged by technology and tactics that don't require matching Russia tank for tank or plane for plane. So where does this leave us? We're in a moment where Putin is facing decisions that have no good outcomes, where Ukraine is demonstrating capabilities that are rewriting military doctrine in real time, and where the White House is carefully managing its response to maintain flexibility while not restricting Ukraine's most effective offensive tool. The Engels attack wasn't just another strike on another target. It was a demonstration of sustained capability, a message that nowhere in Russia is truly safe, and a strategic challenge that Putin has no easy answer for. The war in Ukraine has gone through several distinct phases: the initial Russian invasion, the Ukrainian defense and Russian withdrawal from Kyiv, the grinding artillery battles in the east, the Ukrainian counteroffensives, and now we're in a new phase, one characterized by Ukraine's deep strike campaign and Russia's struggle to adapt. This phase will determine what kind of negotiating position each side has when talks eventually happen. And make no mistake, talks will happen eventually. But the terms of those talks, the leverage each side brings, the red lines that can't be crossed, all of that is being determined right now by attacks like the one on Engels and the responses they provoke. I want you to understand something crucial here. This isn't just about one airbase or one attack. This is about the fundamental question of whether a smaller power being invaded by a larger neighbor can develop asymmetric capabilities that neutralize traditional military advantages. Ukraine is providing a real-world test case, and the answer so far appears to be yes. But maintaining that capability, sustaining these operations, continuing to develop and deploy increasingly sophisticated drones, all of that requires resources, intelligence support, and tacit approval from Western partners. The White House response or non-response to the Engels attack is therefore just as important as the attack itself. It signals what Ukraine can continue to do and sets parameters for how far they can push. As we move deeper into 2026, watch for these indicators. Watch how Russia redistributes air defense assets, because that will tell you what they consider most vulnerable. Watch how Ukraine allocates its long-range strike resources, because that reveals their strategic priorities. Watch how Western governments, particularly the Trump administration, respond to increasingly bold Ukrainian operations, because that sets the boundaries for what's acceptable. And most importantly, watch what Putin does in the next few weeks, because he's facing urgent decisions about whether to escalate, negotiate, or muddle through with a strategy that's clearly not working. The attack on Engels 2 isn't the end of this story. It's the beginning of a new chapter, one where the rules of engagement are being rewritten, where strategic depth no longer guarantees security, and where small, relatively cheap drones are forcing major powers to rethink everything they thought they knew about modern warfare. And that, more than any single explosion or any one destroyed aircraft, is what will shape not just the outcome of this war, but conflicts for decades to come. Stay informed, stay critical, and don't just accept the mainstream narrative. Dig deeper, ask questions, and understand that what you're watching unfold is history being made in real time. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to understand what's really happening in Ukraine. This is Ryan Blake, reminding you that the most important stories are often the ones they're not fully telling you. Until next time, stay sharp.